to talk about being in those deep valleys and then arising, ascending to the top of the mountain, which, we often associate with joy. But you start with sadness. So if we're talking about the book of Psalms that so many of us are familiar with, we've got this big spectrum of all sorts of emotion here. I've begun to to describe that in the introduction, but take us into this now that we're here, a God of sadness.
Yeah, so we are actually in that valley. I mean, reality is, and this is a reality that we can all too easily lose touch with in our very affluent context, comparatively, of course, to the rest of the world, and actually to the rest of most of humanity who have lived in the world. We live in a pretty cushioned existence, and we can easily forget, actually, that we live as broken people in a broken world, as very broken people, I should say, in a very broken world. And you might say that the psalmists, they lived really at the coal face of that reality. They experienced all the harshest elements of that reality, a reality that's still with us today. But of course, one of the most important elements of that reality is not just the state of the world, but the state that we begin with. And there's a principle in Psalm 126 that says, "Those who sow in tears will reap with songs of joy." And in a sense, unless we actually are willing to face the sad realities of our human predicament, then we will inevitably therefore remain almost dissociated, actually, from reality, almost perhaps you could even say anesthetized to reality. And when that happens, there's a sense in which we also cut ourselves off from the possibility of true joy. And so we can often tend to replace the fleeting pleasures of life, and there's so much that is pleasurable, and God created the world for us to enjoy and take pleasure in. But those pleasures can, and particularly in our very entertainment-oriented culture, can easily become a kind of anesthetic that anesthetizes us spiritually, that prevents us from feeling sadness and joy. And so I think the big challenge of the Psalms is to get off the anesthetics and actually to feel the brunt of reality, and perhaps even the difficult aspects of that we need to face about ourselves and the world. That's where the ladder to joy begins. The first rung is right down in the depths of that reality.
Wow. Sowing in tears, reaping in joy, starting in the valley, but looking to ascend to the mountaintop. Now, I don't want to give away all the secrets of your book, but when you've ascended to the mountaintop, you like to say that the joy that you are pursuing, the happiness that you are seeking, is always associated with salvation. Give us some thought here, because here we are, perhaps in our sinful nature, aspiring to something that is happiness, searching up all sorts of dry gullies, looking for some level of happiness. Just explain to us how you see the mountaintop as being associated with salvation.
Yeah, the pursuit of happiness is well known as a preoccupation of our culture, and there's some problems with that as it's construed in our culture, because and in fact this was the topic of a Pixar film. I don't know if you remember, a number of years ago there was a Pixar film about, oh man, what was the film called again?
If I was a fan, I'd be able to help you here.
Oh, no, that's right. I've just gone blank on the title of the film, but it had the different emotions, and the little girl. I even remember the plot really well. The little girl Riley, and in her head, there's a control panel, and there's four key emotions. At that five, I think, at that control panel. And sadness is one of those emotions, and the other emotions keep trying to get sadness out, get sadness off the control, and then sadness actually ends up getting shunted out of the control center in Riley's head, this little girl in this film. And everything goes wrong because you need sadness. Sadness is the thing. And and there's the classic scene where Riley, she runs away from home, and there's this big dilemma because she's unable to, because she needs to feel sadness to bring her back home. And and from a biblical point of view, we could think of, I mean, for a start, I just thought the name of the film will come to me, I'm sure, in the course of the interview. But it reminds me of the prodigal son. The turning point for the prodigal son was that realization. It was in that moment in the pig pen, the realization that that he needed to go home, and I think the pursuit of happiness, I think in one sense is legitimate, because we all want to be happy, and that's an irrepressible desire. But ultimately, we've also got to understand that you can't just generate that artificially. That it's not just a feeling. Happiness isn't just a feeling. It's actually something more like a state of being, and of course the central aspect of what Jesus has done for us is to save us actually from alienation from God. But in order to connect with that salvation, we have to actually feel the pain of that alienation. And there's an inherent deep spiritual trauma involved in being in conflict with God, in alienation from God. And if we don't allow ourselves to feel that, then we're not really able to access what Jesus did for us. Now, the biblical expression for this is, Psalm 51 says the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit and a contrite heart, and it's contrition, it's penitence that really is the doorway, and that comes back to that idea of sowing in tears and reaping in joy. That's why, that's the place where we really meet Jesus. We meet Jesus in the valley of penitence, and then we're lifted up. James, it's interesting in book of James, he says, that we should, he calls the church, to mourn in order that they might be lifted up to joy. So, there is this really interesting relationship between those two aspects. And of the famous intellectual and writer author Brene Brown, I think she put it well when she said that you can't selectively dull emotions. If you look to dull and anesthetize the negative emotions, then you anesthetize yourself emotionally overall. And so she, her thing is that we need to be willing to be vulnerable and feel the pain of what is painful, so that we can feel the joy of what is wonderful.
Well, that Pixar film you're talking about, I think, is called Inside Out. Am I right?
Okay. Thank you. I don't know why I just went blank on the title.
But I know we'll all be able to identify with this thought that if I have a pursuit of happiness, then I'll want to somehow or other suppress the sadness. And you like to explore what happens in the Psalms around suffering, around hope, around seasons that we go through, raw emotions, and sometimes we don't appreciate so much. We're trying to avoid those sort of sadness things, so we maybe don't want to go and jump into some raw emotions. But jumping into the raw emotions, should you be afraid of that, or is this something you can say, okay, I'm going to take a risk here. I'm going to jump into, say, even Psalm 88, which I know is described as one of the darkest poems in the book of Psalms. What are your thoughts about taking the risk and getting into some sadness?
Yeah, well, I think it's actually about ceasing to suppress those, because I do think there's an active process of suppressing some of those experiences. So a psalm like Psalm 88, one of the remarkable things about those psalms is how kind of raw they are. There's a genre in the Psalms, the genre of complaint, scholars talk about, the complaint psalms as well as the lament psalms, and they're really complaining. There are some very strong complaints there, because there's a sense of disappointment. God, where are you, and why aren't you answering a prayer? Now that's a level of honesty. That's how they feel, and we're called into a relationship here, and in a relationship you say how you feel, but I think one of the problems is that in our spiritual culture, if I can call it that, we've sidelined those sorts of expressions. Like, for example, Neil, like, could you imagine being in a prayer meeting, and everyone's sort of praying, out loud, and someone pipes up and says, God, why aren't you answering our prayers? Why are you so far away from us? And it's hard to imagine, isn't it? you just,
Yep.
And yet in the Psalms, which are really the model book of what faith looks like, this is, in a sense, that's the role of the Psalms, shows us what faith looks like in the different experiences of life, and that's what faith does. That's what faith does. It doesn't, because what happens in like, let's say you feel like God's really let you down, you feel disappointed. What people tend to do is think, well, like, I'm not, I shouldn't feel that, and so they repress that, and then at worst still, they actually have a tendency to lower expectations of God. I'm just gonna expect less of God, and then that causes people to then pray less, because I don't want to expect too much of God, and everything goes downhill from there. Now, but what faith does is that it actually holds in tension, the circumstances where God doesn't seem to be, doing what they want to see God do, and yet they're willing to hold that in tension with the promise, and go to God and complain about that. Now, not grumbling. Grumbling is what you do when you're walking away from God. Complaint is what you do when you're pressing in, just like in Luke chapter 18, the woman that bashed on the door of the judge, and she wouldn't let up. It's her persistence in prayer, and it says that Jesus told them that story, so that they could keep on praying and never give up. And at the end of telling that story about this persistent widow, the parable of the persistent widow, it's referred to as, Jesus says at the end of that, and when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? And so there's such a beautiful tie-in actually with what Jesus is looking for in terms of faith, and what you see in the Psalms. That's what faith actually does. It doesn't let up. It's like, if you feel disappointed with God, don't just skulk away, right? And to think, oh, I'll just have to expect less of God, or don't make excuses for God, or, it's just like, no, faith is persistence and pushing in. It's not presuming how God is going to answer. It's not presuming when God is going to answer. We've got to be careful about that. And the psalmists are careful not to do that. They let God be God. That's part of faith as well. But the Psalms are always prayed in a covenant context, and the covenant context means that they understand God's made a commitment to them, and they're always on about the hesed, the covenant faithfulness of God, and so they hold God to that. That's where these complaints, like Psalm 88, it's often referred to as the Psalm of darkness, but I would suggest the light of faith is burning bright in that psalm.
Well, it so happens that I have a song of yours, one of your psalms, and with your band, Sons of Korah, and it is Psalm 88. And as you've just brought us to a point where we can appreciate that sadness is a part of what our conversation is today as we explore these issues of spirituality in the book of Psalms, let's have a listen to this and we'll continue our conversation.